Before we ask Carla to read the time certain, we're going to turn to our esteemed attorney who has
Call the roll.
We'll do roll call first.
Let's do the roll call first, Carla.
Hardesty,
Here.
Udaly, Fritz,
Here.
Wheeler, Fish.
Here. Now we will turn to our esteemed counsel who has a statement to read.
Welcome to the Portland City Council. The City Council represents all Portlanders and meets to do the city's business. The presiding officer preserves order and decorum during City Council meetings so everyone can feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the council clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or the first readings of ordinances. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. If it does not, you may be ruled out of order. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you are a lobbyist. If you are representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When you have 30 seconds left, a yellow light goes on. When your time is done, a red light goes on. If you are in the audience and would like to show your support for something that is said, please feel free to do a thumbs up. If you want to express that you do not support something, please feel free to do a thumbs down. Please remain seated in council chambers unless you're entering or exiting. If you are filming the proceedings, please do not use bright lights or disrupt the meeting. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting or interrupting testimony or council deliberations, will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being ejected for the remainder of the meeting. After being ejected, a person who fails to leave the meeting is subject to arrest for trespass. Thank you for helping your fellow Portlanders feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe.
Well, thank you very much. And Carla, let me turn to you, and would you please read the first time certain item number 391?
Yes. Accept the Portland Historic Landmarks Commission 2018 State of the City Preservation Report, Part B.
Well, first of all, to our invited guests and members of the public that are here today, you've probably noticed that I am not Mayor Ted Wheeler. I am serving as the president of the council. Mayor Wheeler is going to be delayed about 30 minutes, but looks forward to catching the second half of the presentation. And he has asked me to read some prepared remarks. It is a pleasure to introduce the Portland Historic Landmark Commission's State of the City Report 2018, Part B. The Historic Landmarks Commission was here last November to present the longer 2018 report. This is a follow-up to that report with slightly revised goals and new requests of City Council. The Historic Landmarks Commission is a 7-member volunteer commission that meets twice a month, often for many hours, as they review land use cases and provide design and policy advice. They are a dedicated, hardworking, and passionate group that includes Kristen Miner, Chair, Maya Foti, Vice Chair, Matthew Roman, Wendy Chung, Annie Mahoney, Ernestina Fonmayer, and Andrew Smith. I'd like to ask all of the members of the commission that are here today to please stand so the council can recognize and thank you for your service. Thank you very much, and I apologize for any mispronunciations of any names along the way. They're not in phonetics in front of me. I would also like to thank Hillary Adam, who staffs the commission, and Cara Fioravanti, who supervises the Bureau of Development's services staff who do historic resource reviews. The commission will be presenting their 11th report before council, but they have been operating in the city since circa 1969, providing leadership and expertise on maintaining and enhancing Portland's historic and architectural heritage. This report comes at a time when we are confronted with facing existential challenges like climate change, housing affordability, and a potential catastrophic seismic event. I look forward to hearing more today from the Historic Landmarks Commission members and invited testifiers, and am committed to working with the Commission to meet their stated goals. Chair Kristen Miner, would you please come forward and begin your presentation? Welcome to council.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the mayor's introductory remarks as well. So as stated, I'm Kristen Miner. I'm chair of the Portland Historic Landmarks Commission. And we are presenting the 2018 Part B report for you today. The reason why you saw us so little time ago was because we're moving our timing of our annual report up to match the fiscal year. So you
Great.
should see us from now on at about the same time.
Great.
Maya, do you want to?
Let me just make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on, I'm
Great.
gonna go back. I need my
No,
glasses.
we're good.
It's very bright. Okay.
Okay. So the mayor's remarks already did go ahead and introduce the members of the commission. And I just want to add to that we are a relatively young commission. In other words, I shouldn't say young, perhaps new commission would be a better way to put it, in that we're all in our first term. And so far, I'm excited that we have so much expertise and passion and are really coming together. And it's a group that will be able to work together for some time. And I also wanted to add to the mayor's remarks, he did note that Hillary Adam and Cara Fioravanti are special liaisons from BDS. I also wanted to recognize Brandon Spencer Hartle. Although he's not here today, he had to teach a class. He is just instrumental in helping us understand all of the legislative work that Bureau of Planning and Sustainability does. So I thought I'd start from the beginning and go ahead and advance one more if you would, Maya.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So what do? We do make land use decisions. That's the bulk of our work. But we also make a series of formal recommendations to this body. We also provide advice to other commissions and agencies, and that encompasses quite a bit of other internal city agencies as well as other commissions. And then finally, we do outreach. I think as you'll see in a moment, one of our goals is to do more of that outreach work. We definitely feel that it's sorely needed, but we coordinate with neighborhoods, advocacy groups, and with state agencies. And I'll just go ahead and start in with what we're asking of you. So I basically have two pleas for money for two separate bureaus. One of them is really to supplement the Bureau of Development Services land use fees with some general fund dollars. The reason for this is that staff do so much more than land use reviews. They serve on advisory committees, legislative reviews. They provide in-depth customer information and assistance, as well as staff, not only our commission, but the design commission. It's quite a bit of extra work. Then I also wanted to make a plea for Bureau of Planning and Sustainability for the historic resources inventory. And as you probably know, the Bureau has managed to start this very small pilot survey work out in Montevilla, which we're extremely excited to hear the results of that. And they've been working with that neighborhood, and we want to hear how that went in every sense. It'll keep coming through the system, hopefully here, to add to the data that we want to compile with the HRI. So that HRI actually needs some level of annual funding. And the reason for needing annual funding for that is that they have to manage the data, and so they kind of need a salaried person there to work with neighborhoods, to do outreach, and to manage that database.
So what we are reviewing, one of the things we've been really
Can you move
involved
the
with.
mic just a little
Sorry.
closer? That way
This,
we'll be sure to hear you. Thanks.
Sure. Recently, are all these city regulatory initiatives that are rolling out. There's the Historic Resources Code Project, the Residential Infill Project, Better Housing by Design. These are, as of now, they're not directly related to historic review, but we are a regulatory body that enforces these regulations that are being mandated by the city. And so we've been trying really hard to understand what they are and how they could potentially be touching historic, which means, for example, Kristen printing out binders of this material and going through every single word to understand in the future how it might impact us. Because while now they're just words, in 10 years they could come back and we have to enforce these things. So we're really trying to understand them, and I can't say that that's an easy task, but we're trying very hard.
Can you go back to that slide for 1 second?
Sure, of course.
My understanding is that the council may be taking up Better Housing by Design this summer. My understanding is residential infill project may come mid-fall, and it may not actually come to a vote, if there is a vote at council, till, say, January. Can we assume that since you have put down reservations and potential amendments in this slide, that when we are taking up these matters, you'll send us a letter reminding us about your concerns, and if there are specific amendments, that you'll include those in your correspondence?
Yes, Commissioner, thank you for asking, and we definitely intend to not only provide a letter, but probably come and testify so that, you know, you can ask us questions and we can hear your feedback.
And let me just say, you know, Commissioner Hardesty once served in the legislature, and in the legislature, the amendments come fast and furious, and it's just part of the process. And at some point in a big omnibus piece of legislation, there's a substitute with amendments. And in my experience, we get lots of letters from people expressing concerns, but we rarely get appended to the letters proposed amendments. And I don't want to make extra work for you, but for example, under residential infill, you say move away from residential unit counts to form or volume-based allowances.
Right.
I have absolutely no idea what that means, although I'm going to make sure that I understand it when we get closer.
Right.
But working with the city attorney's office to draft an amendment that says strike this, add this, whatever, will make it easier for people like me to understand where you're coming from. And I am very interested in making sure that we have incentives for preserving historic structures. So I urge you to consider both a letter and draft amendments when the time comes.
We can do our best, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Another one is the,
I thought you were going to go, could you go back? please?
sure, sure.
Mike's not on.
I thought you were going to go through each one.
Oh,
but
I'm happy
you went
to.
so quick.
Yeah, sure. I
well, let me
was like,
just-
you really want to go through this.
No, let me just ask you then
Right.
about the residential infill. Your third bullet, stop developer-led demolitions and cookie-cutter construction that doesn't offer affordability or quality. You are aware that we have 7 years of permits already issued out on the street that developers could do pretty much what they want. Are you referring to the next decade we should do that? And I would suggest that we won't have anything left that we will need to advise developers on. And so I'm kind of, that just seems like that's kind of out of left field. So could you give me some context for that recommendation?
I can make a stab at that, Commissioner Hardesty. I think what we're looking for is always incentives to help people keep and fix up their existing structures, rather than make it easy for developers to demolish and then build new. So when we say, I mean, we're using words like cookie cutter. I understand that's not a very flattering term, but we have definitely seen the impact in older neighborhoods of developers coming in, taking down a house, and then putting up something that's twice its size. And, I understand there's a market for this, but it's our job, I think, in the government to push back a little bit, provide incentives, but also make sure that our codes are written in a way that don't incentivize that kind of behavior.
And I'll add on to that. Oh, I'm sorry.
no,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, just one of the things that we were asking to be considered is to give more value to keeping houses on a property that we didn't see in there as of now. Because it was sort of like, if you keep it, that's great, and you got just as many points or whatever, and to kind of give more value to keeping and densifying versus allowing it. So that's one cut and dry example that we commented on.
So I will just say that I don't think there's any clear idea whether or not this council will support residential infill or not. There seems to be a widespread of ideas about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But having said that, clearly we need to be building more housing. We need housing at every income level in every neighborhood. And so as I think about just the term affordable, is not sufficient for me. What I need you to come back with is, what do you mean when you say that? Because developers say that for studios that cost $1,600 a month. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say affordable. Affordable for who would be a really good definition. And so thank you for that.
And if I could follow up on that, I got my second round of boot camp the other day on RIP. And Joe Zender and his team have sort of started me. It's boot camp for dummies, and it was starting at the very basics and then working through, all the work. I was struck by one statistic that is, under one scenario, RIP, if successful, would add 4,000 units over 15 years. That's not a lot of units. No. That's not a lot of units given the amount of heat this proposal is likely to generate. That's number one. Number two, it is not driven by this notion of affordability. No. Affordability within the residential infill project is actually about stabilizing costs at the market rate, but not building housing that we each may consider truly affordable, which is, affordable for whom? People below 30% MFI, people below 60% MFI. So those are two things. But number three, the demolition, I think there's going to be a lot of focus on displacement when the council comes up with its discussion, because there's some evidence that the RIP could lead to some displacement. But with respect to demolitions, I think what I'm going to be interested in hearing from you is, given that they're talking about an overlay which would allow for two duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, among other things. How much of that is retrofitting existing buildings, and how much of that is demolition and replacement? And I know that you have a view about demolition and replacement that goes beyond just historic resources. You have a view that is aligned with climate change and other things. So I'm hoping the conversation gets postponed to later in the fall, because it's going to be very, very challenging for this council to get its arms around RIP. And this is a preview of where we're going to be all over the place, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate your laying this out, because you're going back to the original intent, which is what we told the project to do back in 2016, was to look at how close to transit in smaller areas can you allow single-family homes to be converted into duplexes or triplexes. It was not intended to be adding to the demolitions, because although Commissioner Hardesty is correct in terms of the multifamily developments in the pipeline, for single family, that's not the case, and that each home has to go through a demolition delay, and it's quite the rigmarole. Whereas if we made it a lot easier for people to convert their larger houses into either condominiums or rental units, that is greener, more affordable, and doesn't result in demolitions. So I very much appreciate you putting this on the table, and I personally think it's not going to be possible to amend the residential infill project to make it do what we originally intended unless we start all over again.
if I could just make one final comment. There are two bills, as you know, pending in the legislature, one sponsored by the Speaker and one sponsored by the President of the Senate. If either or both pass, it's not even clear residential infill project still has currency,
Right.
given fundamental land use changes that are proposed at the statewide level. So we're going to have a chance to spend a lot of time together having this conversation, and I think you're hearing from all three of us that we appreciate you previewing some of your concerns.
Okay, thank you.
So continuing on, the DOZA is another initiative that we recently just finished reviewing. And that's another one where it's basically process improvements, but also generating design guidelines that will have a real impact on many of our commercial districts, which are not currently have designated historic, but they could be designated historic in the future. So anything that we do to them now could preclude potentially preservation or conservation or really understanding what that neighborhood core was like in the future. So that's another one that, again, lots of dog-eared pages on Kristen's desk.
It's not just mine.
And then the URM ordinance, so we've been tracking this very closely, and we've really been trying to follow it in a meaningful way. We support the URM ordinance. We understand the complexity of the URM ordinance. We understand the importance of implementing it for the safety of our inhabitants, including my children that go to PPS and are in URM buildings. So, yeah, it hits home. On the flip side, we also are sort of terrified that people panic and they start demolishing their historic buildings, and equally terrified that all of a sudden it's a free-for-all and we're going to start gutting historic buildings and defacing them in any number of ways. So it's complex. So we've been trying to be proactive in a lot of ways. We have been involved with a big symposium. I think you might have all have heard of it. I know Commissioner Hardesty, we've been trying to pull you in to present. I know somebody from your office might be there. We're pulling in people from all over the world. It's really trying to be a neutral conversation to really look at these issues. California has done this before. They have a URM policy. California is completely different. It has a much more nuanced rules pertaining to historic, much better protections, much better opportunities for funding sources for owners of URM buildings. We are inviting somebody up from the city of St. Helena who actually implemented a mandatory URM policy. It wasn't as many buildings as we have in Portland, but just sort of what do's and don'ts and how can we do this and how can we make it a win-win instead of people getting beat up. And it's a huge question to ask, and it's very complicated, and it's not going to get resolved soon. It's been done before, and we're really, really, really trying to, be engaged and be proactive, and hopefully be a neutral resource to you, because we feel like we really are on that fine line of wanting it done and being afraid if it gets done. So I feel like we can really sort of be a good neutral sounding board, hopefully.
So if I may?
Please.
I just want to say, we've actually suspended or changed the URM ordinance, as you may know. And we plan to come back to the city council before the year is out with a new proposal. A lot will depend on whether or not we're able to get funding through the legislative body. We have had work groups with both small business owners as well as nonprofit and faith leaders. And as you said, this is a very complicated process. I don't think anybody wants buildings to fall down on people in an earthquake or some other major disaster, but we can't just mandate that people do things that they just cannot financially afford to do without providing some assistance. And so I'm glad to have been in the lead of trying to make those changes take place. There are no easy solutions to URMs. I share the desire to maintain these beautiful buildings that we have throughout downtown. But as you know, it's not just a Portland problem. Statewide, we have over 5,000 URM buildings. Every main street has them. And so it's not just a Portland problem. We have to be really thoughtful. And California, some cities in California are a model, and some are just the opposite. Some tell you what not to do, and some provided financial assistance and actually help buildings really do the upgrades that were necessary. We're fortunate in Portland because we have the Portland Clean Energy Fund Initiative. The legislature has this way. No one else in Oregon will be able to get it, but that's another conversation. But it will be a wonderful opportunity to partner with those owners to do both green energy improvements at the same time we're doing seismic upgrades. So I see this as an opportunity for real partnerships, and I would love to see you come back with some innovative ideas. I believe I will be out of the country doing a symposium, which is probably why I won't be able to participate, but otherwise I'd love to be there. And I will definitely have a staffer there.
Okay, wonderful.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Nice. I think that's,
Okay. I wanted to talk briefly about our overreaching goals for this past year and then really moving into this next year. So there's 5 of them, and just each of them in turn very quickly here. First, ensuring that historic preservation benefits all citizens. So it's the idea that we
I'm so
really-
sorry to keep interrupting, but the term citizens, could we put community members?
Absolutely.
You know, it's just one of those words that has taken on a very bad meaning. I know what you mean, but it
Yeah.
would be much more inclusive for us to say all community
I
members.
appreciate that, Commissioner. So the idea behind this is really to seek more equity in preservation, so that preservation is really not only about the grandest houses or the most exclusive neighborhoods, but that it really does help us to preserve those places that matter to all Portlanders, to find those places that matter in all of the areas of our city. The next one, to engage with our community, and as I mentioned before, we really have committed to make much more of an effort to reach out, to go out to neighborhoods, talk to the neighborhood associations, and really, educate and be educated. The next one, advocate for local and state incentives. Commissioner Fish, I thank you so much for actually saying already that you are as committed as you can be to incentives. And, just the idea that repairing and reusing is always harder than demolition and building new, so that we need incentives to help people do that.
Let me just say for the record, we're now joined by the mayor, so I am ceremoniously handing back the gavel. Mayor, we did a few other things that we'll share with you later about your budget.
It never gets old. It never gets old. Thank you.
By the way, the next one you have about supporting Portland's unique places, density should first be achieved through additions and adaptive reuse rather than demolitions. I don't know whether you intended to, but you provoked quite a flurry of emails as a result of that. And I got one from Doug Klotz, who's not shy about weighing in on anything.
Yes, I know Doug well.
And he kind of picked a fight with you a little bit, but I think I know what you mean. And where it's possible to adaptively reuse historic structures, we should explore that. That is the least carbon impact when we do that. Certainly adding density by adding more units in places that can accommodate it is an entirely different matter. But I enjoyed getting a sense of your position and then having Doug weigh in and pick a fight with you. So at the very least, you're relevant in the broader discussion.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. We do have Doug at a fair number of our hearings. And then the last one finally is to prioritize sustainability. And, the old quote that the greenest building is the one that already exists is true, and preservation really can be a part of that answer to sustainability. So next I wanted to drive home maybe some of our goals with just a couple of bits of data. And I hope that you have had a chance to look at our actual report. We have sources cited, so if any of you are interested in where this data comes from, please do just take a moment and, and well, I don't know if you'll have the virtual report that you can click on the link, but if you have to type it in, then please do so. Some of these studies are super interesting and hopeful. So I'll touch on one from the top row, which is just about sort of the category of affordability, and just to leave you with the idea that 85% of the larger Pacific Northwest tenant households, and that's renters, live in older existing housing. And so I think what that statistic drives home for me is really the need to keep and retrofit and seismically upgrade so much of that existing housing stock. The next category in the area of economics, I wanted to just briefly highlight a comparative look at $1 million spent on new construction versus retrofit construction. And in the new construction, that same amount of money generates 30.6 jobs. In retrofit construction, it generates 35.4 jobs. So that's just an illustration of how it can actually be good for the economy, making more jobs the more we push toward retrofitting.
Excuse me, these are national numbers, not local numbers. Is that correct?
Actually, well, I should know that. The top one is definitely a local study, and that's the larger Pacific Northwest. So it's an area encompassing, I think, as far up as Seattle, and then down in Oregon. And the economics is probably a national number. I'll check on that source. I don't
It would have
with
to
me right
be,
now.
because there's no way that's happening in Portland.
But it could, I think. And then finally, I wanted to highlight one statistic from the area of sustainability. And that is that it can take up to 80 years for a new, even if it's very energy efficient building, to recover the environmental impact of its initial construction. So again, it's a real win for sustainability to embrace preservation.
Questions on that? I move on.
I think this is me, right? Yes. Okay. The next slide is our 2019 watch list. And this is just another aspect of what we do as a commission, which is to kind of try to stay on top of and speak up about policies or code or somebody doing something out there that actively would encourage demolitions or the loss of important historic fabric in our town. And so we have 3 items on our watch list. One of them is the new Chinatown, Japantown Historic District and the original Blanchet House, which unfortunately has really been neglected in the past years. And I think I just saw yesterday from the PDC, or Prosper Portland, excuse me, that there's an RFP out for Block 25, which includes the Blanchet House, as well as the Right to Dream site, which, we're excited to see that development.
But by the way, I know you've been critical in the past of so-called demolition by neglect. So we did that. I think that was an argument that the commission made before the Dirty Duck building was demolished.
Right.
I will say this about the Blanchet House. A, it's been replaced by a much nicer building.
Yes.
B, it is, my guess is it's a URM that if there were to be an investment, would trigger an enormous cost in retrofitting. And C, it has one little piece of that block, which is now ripe for development in an area that craves new development. So I'll remain agnostic on the Blanchet House, but I can think of more distinguished examples in that neighborhood. I'm I'm a little surprised to see that one, just because I think it has deteriorated to the point where it's almost an attractive nuisance.
And I am not going to argue any of the points that you made. I mean, I think it's difficult to save every building, certainly, so I'll just leave that. But I also just want to highlight that entire district is a rocky area.
Okay.
And then secondly, Maya talked a little bit about this already, but generally URM buildings across the east side, and those often occur at, these kind of commercial hubs, where two main streets cross each other, and along those little main streets. So those are definitely in danger, and we are concerned. And then finally, the Cornerstones of Community Resources, and that's the name of a study that's been done by the AHC and the Bosco Milligan Foundation, and it's really identifying important historic resources, mostly in North and Northeast Portland. And that area has already undergone some very heavy gentrification pressure, quite a bit of change already, and we're losing resources such as that pictured, the Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church. Hopefully not this one.
It's going?
No. Please, please don't get worried. This resource is actually being saved and renovated, but there are others that are definitely at risk.
I was ready to go stand up and chain myself
Thank
to it.
you.
So Matt
I
Hennessy would be
appreciate
here
your
in a
concern.
heartbeat if there was an issue.
And it has a historic designation, so it cannot be torn down. It has to be repaired.
So thank you for that information. How many of the structures on the Bosco Milligan inventory have a historic designation?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can find out.
Well, again, it underpins the importance of updating our historic resources inventory because there's so many buildings out there and we don't know what their historic value is. And incentives are tied with those values. So you potentially have building owners who own value, who don't know they have value, and they can't get money for what they could. So it's just another reason to fund the historic resources.
So I was going to-
have some news on this front. I knew I would have something useful to contribute. I'll just interject quickly. The historic resources inventory would be done by the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I've directed them to do it in the next fiscal year. It will be done.
Thank you, Matt. So
Fantastic.
my, what I see in your budget is $30,000 for that, but the request last time was for $80,000 last year, and that was designated for east of 82nd. So maybe I could have staff come up after you've finished your presentation, because I think it would be useful to have that discussion. I was going to wait to ask my questions about this till the end, but I think it does tie into the both the preservation, but also the unreinforced masonry buildings. And I think we've seen as demolitions have come through council, there are some buildings which are really not all that special. They may be old, but they would cost so much to upgrade, and even then they wouldn't be all that special, that we don't mind if they get redeveloped. So I'd like to know from staff how many of the 1650 unreinforced masonry buildings have actually been surveyed to find out are they historic or not. And if we're already prioritizing east of 82nd, which I support that, is there a second package maybe for the unreinforced masonries so that we can just decide of those 1650, we really want to preserve X number of them? And then cross-reference that with the Bosco Milligan. It sounds like they've already done some work for us.
Yes, absolutely, although it's been really tied to African-American resources. So, I think there's a lot of communities that we need to have those conversations with
Right.
and see
Yeah.
who needs, surveying more.
Necessary
perhaps.
but not sufficient, yes.
Yes, exactly.
And also, buildings have more than just architectural value. It could also have a value that's tied to history or the culture, and
Right.
that has to be acknowledged. And sometimes it's a cornerstone of a neighborhood, and it might be a very modest building.
Point, Maya.
I guess I'm concerned that now that Inner Northeast has been pretty much demolished and rebuilt, now we're going to protect other neighborhoods from the same kind of demolishing and being rebuilt. As I think about historic East Portland, I'm hard pressed to think of buildings that would fit that criteria. And so what plans do you have to ensure that the losses that the African American community continues to experience in the city of Portland isn't exacerbated by this new effort that you're taking on?
You mean new effort by the renewing the historic resources inventory? Is that?
Well, I mean, what I hear is that we're now, really going to be serious about preserving some historic buildings after we've, again, totally rebuilt what was traditionally a historic African-American community. And we've had 3 or 4 that have been torn down and rebuilt, whether it was for a stadium or whether it was for some other urban renewal project. And so it just feels like the horse has left the barn as far as it is in preserving the African-American cultural history. I suspect other communities of color would make the same argument. And so I guess my question is, what are we trying to preserve?
Well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that the inventory is only giving information. It's not designating. So it's really understanding what they have, and then it's the owner or the community who takes the next step. So it's just putting the tools into their hand to be able to decide whether that's of importance to them.
Do you know how many structures are on the Bosco Milligan Foundation inventory of the African American resources about? If you don't, we can find out later.
Yeah,
That's okay.
I
don't know off the top of my
to
head.
know.
Yeah, I cannot
There's
remember.
obviously at least one that's on the list, so.
yeah. We definitely have lost some,
Yes.
though, just
I'm
in
sure
the
a lot.
intervening, years that they've been doing this study. So,
Okay, thank you.
And one possibility, since there's a lot of interest in the historic resources inventory, because this is in the budget, this will create a conversation around this subject. And so maybe we could hold off on all those specific questions for the budget process, which unfolds starting in the next couple of days.
Right.
And then maybe we could have you come back just for a mini session focused narrowly on that question of the historic resources inventory, if that's okay with Mike
That
Paul.
sounds good.
thanks, we'd be
Great,
happy to.
thank you. Because then we'll have staff in the room and everybody can be well prepped for the conversation.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Good, thank you.
So these are just some of our project highlights that we've reviewed. One was the Portland Art Museum, the Rothko Pavilion. I guess that's also a good example of why the DARs work. This was a complicated project, a new addition between 2 landmark buildings on a piece of property that was deeded to the public, and then how do you enclose it and still keep it open to the public? So there was a lot of public input. And when we do our hearings and our design advice requests, we really try to take into account all the different comments, all the people that testify and they write, so everybody feels like they're heard. And it was, this was one of the more complicated ones, but we feel like at the end, we had maybe 3 people show up to testify. So it sort of, I think, we felt meant that the process worked, and the design team worked really hard to respond to our comments. They took it seriously, and so that was a highlight in the end. Portland City Hall, that's this building here. It does have a green roof, which is mandated by the city of Portland, and with a lot of work, there is going to be a green roof. And it's, again, one of the sustainability initiatives of the city of Portland. And there's all sorts of statistics, I'm sure you know them all, of the benefits of a green roof. There's also stone conservation, so a lot of really needed work on this landmark. And then let's see, this was a highlight, just because, and this is getting into a little bit of the weeds of what we review, is, how do you design in historic context? And do you go faux historic, or do you design modern? And we've had such a hard time finding designs that really are modern and yet contextual. And so this was just an example of one that we all came together unanimously, agreed that this was a really wonderful modern addition into a very historic neighborhood. Let's see, this is a good example. I love this example. This was actually a type 2 hearing, but you can see the building on the left was what it looked like, and then the owners, their own initiative, no historic review or any mandating of having to take it back, were able to remove the faux facade that you see on the left, and they did a really nice restoration of this storefront. And it's just a great example, too, to your point, Commissioner Hardesty, is also sometimes when these buildings, they look completely different. In fact, they're there. It just needs funding to take it back and an idea of what was there. So let's see, another one was the Woodlark Cornelius Hotel. This was two massive historic buildings that were really falling apart, and so it's just a great example of developers coming and doing just a really amazing job of.
By the way, it's really a testament to the power of the current housing and building boom that this structure actually had a private funder willing to come in and tackle it, because I think we were all resigned to the fact that it was going to be a derelict building for a long time and potentially a demolition at some point. But for someone to come in, and given the condition of the building, I can't even imagine the cost to put in and to make it seismically safe and to renovate it and to put a hotel there. We're gonna have a hotel in every corner along with a Starbucks if we're not careful. But that building was an eyesore, and now it's been brought back beautifully. And so one of the benefits of a market that's been very strong.
Yeah. And then the Medallion Apartments, this was just an example of, so this was basically a building that was built, I guess it was in the 70s, and it was in a historic neighborhood, and we reviewed it, and it's just an example, the architects reclad it, and they changed the entry configuration and the parking configuration, and it's low-income housing, and it really, it's just a good example of we can reuse existing buildings, and it's, because of the historic context, this is plugging the review process, you know, the Historic Landmark Commission really worked again with the designers to make it's low-income housing, but it doesn't have to be awful. Let's make it inviting. Let's make it wonderful. Let's make it a place where people want to walk by and want to live. And this is an example of recladding a building, and landscaping made a huge difference. So that was a success. And then finally, we'll point to the Mayo House. The only way that the Historic Landmark Commission was involved, because this was a historic house in a conservation district, and it was moved by the developer, and it would have been demolished. But there was an African-American artist who had a property a couple blocks down and was like, I'd love to have this house and open it into community centers. So they came to the city council, most of you were there, pleading, we want to keep this house. And of course, the Historic Landmark Commission wanted to keep the house because it's historic. We didn't want to see it demolished. And simply by the city council agreeing to waive certain fees and modifying zoning, it sort of was, again, it was a win-win-win-win situation, and it would be so wonderful to see more win-win-win-win situations. And this was especially poignant because of the fact that this family had suffered so much loss. They had a building that was demolished because of the blight, and so it was an opportunity for the extended family to show up and plead their case, and it was just a really touching moment when everything kind of came together in a good way, and you want to see more of that.
I agree. We were actually all in tears when the family was here. But it is a good example of really owning our past history and figuring out how we can be helpful as we move forward. I'd love to know whether or not the repairs are being done, and it's actually going to be the museum that the family hopes to make it. So any info you have, please share.
I think several people here actually attended the move, too, so. And then you're the.
Yeah, and we're at the conclusion now. I wanted to finish off with what we all decided was our project of the year. This was an alteration and a new construction project in the Alphabet Historic District. And what you're seeing in this slide, the small white building in the center of that block is the Buck Prager, which this commission actually denied the demolition of in 2014. This project was certainly controversial, remains controversial, and I'm not sure it's anybody's favorite project, but it's a great example of how the process works and should work. So not only did we get the preservation of a historic building and the adaptation of it to new uses plus seismic upgrades, we got this small building bookended by 2 new volumes, both of which contain affordable housing. We heard many strong opinions on both sides, and you may know that this project has been appealed to LUBA. Still, we can talk about it because the city process is ended. And the commission felt like the outcome was a win. We really do weigh the guidelines that we, have to make our decisions with, the comp plan if we need to, and we work to find an approvable solution. So with that, we'd invite any further questions of us.
Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I always enjoy, and I appreciate very much the work you do. You mentioned that you were hoping for a supplement for land use review services. Do you know if there's a number that was proposed for that? I know we got a lot of input about the cost of a permit for a renovation in a historic house going up from $250 to $1,750.
I might ask staff to come up, since you're going to bring them up anyway. Commissioner Fritz, is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. If anybody has an answer, or if they don't, I'll just get the answer later.
Okay,
And the
no, I
mayor's
believe
requested.
there are some, I believe there are several people here who could definitely answer your question.
Okay,
Yeah.
Very good.
thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Thank
And
you.
now I understand that there is a group of invited guests as well. Is that correct?
Yes, we have 5 invited guests to provide testimony.
Terrific. Thank you. Why don't we have the first 3, if there's a particular order to things? And if you could just state your names for the records, please, when you speak.
My name is Kristen Solomon,
Hey, Kristen.
and I'm an associate at Holst Architecture. I am representing Holst owner Dave Oddie today to offer our support for the important role historic design review plays in our city and offer a current Holst project as an example of how the process is working. Currently, we are designing the transformation of Medallion Apartments, 90 affordable housing units reserved for seniors and persons with disabilities. It is owned by Home Forward and is in the historic Alphabet District of Northwest Portland. The distinct challenge of renovating the exterior of this building in a historic district is that the building was constructed in the 1960s, well after the period of significance for the district. So transforming the appearance of an existing 60s apartment building in an authentic way precludes using many materials, patterns, and scale typically associated with pre-war buildings that characterize the district. Because we had a unique problem, we took our initial thoughts and ideas as soon as possible to the Landmarks Commission for a Design Advice Request, or DAR. This venue allowed our team in the city to get on the same page with what the expectations are for renovating modern buildings in a historic district. Without the DAR, we would have had much more uncertainty early during our process, as binding design review hearing requires more preparation, effort, and risk. Additionally, the DAR gave the community the opportunity to weigh in early, which resulted in a collaborative effort to repair the eastern edge of our property to provide an enclosed trash room, as opposed to an open-air dumpster that had been visible to the neighbors. The DAR also streamlined our process, allowing us to obtain design review approval in only one land use hearing. I am happy to report that we are beginning construction this spring. We found both the commission and the staff, shout out to Grace Jeffries, if she's here, to be reasonable, timely, and united in our goal of ensuring these homes remain intact and are as healthy and beautiful as possible for generations to come. Thank you for your continued support of Historic Design Review and the Historic Landmarks Commission. They are doing important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Whitlock. I'm the Executive Director of the Architectural Heritage Center. Our legal name is the Bosco Milligan Foundation. You were just talking about our project a little earlier. We're a nonprofit educational hub that engages and empowers the public to make our shared architectural and cultural heritage more visible, valued, and part of our vibrant communities. I'm pleased to speak to you today, and in particular, I wanted to encourage the city's investment in the historic resources inventory. So I'm glad to hear the conversations going in that direction, so I'll just try to affirm what sounds like we're already talking about. There are many reasons why this is a beneficial investment, but the one I want to stress is how the HRI can be an effective tool for more inclusive and equitable protection of some of our most vulnerable cultural resources, in particular those associated with Portland's African American community. As the team mentioned earlier, our organization did substantial work in this area, and in the 1990s, we published the in-depth history called Cornerstones that documented the buildings of Portland's African American community. The project was led by our late founding director, Kathy Galbraith, so I was not at the organization at the time, and she was an expert on the city's African American heritage. To answer an earlier question, Cornerstones included nearly 1,300 structures in it, so quite a few. And these were not grand buildings designed by architectural masters, but the everyday spaces that were really part of the community, so record stores, barber shops, restaurants, and so forth. Now, to inventory these structures in the 1990s was groundbreaking because it showed that they were worth counting. And by counting them, you're showing that they're part of our cultural and historical legacy. And now we're also completing a project that Kathy Galbraith was working on when she passed away last fall that will advance the work done in Cornerstones. And we've actually been doing it in partnership with BPS and now a new project team to help carry it along. And it will help facilitate National Register nominations of African American properties. And we also hope it's going to generate a whole future host of projects about African Americans in Portland. So as we were mentioning earlier, many of the buildings that are part of this rich heritage have been demolished. I don't have a number on that, unfortunately. It's just so hard. It's a moving target.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah. The city did create GIS data from the Cornerstones data, and so that's one way we can try to track it, but that was also back in 2010, and you know, it's even changing week by week now. But we'll keep working at that, because it's important to know, but all the more reason to have the HRI. But more will keep.
Thank you, Mayor. I would just say it would be really helpful because we do a really good job of planning, and so it would really be helpful to know what the outcome of all those designations that you found. And I don't know, you said maybe a GIS could help.
Yeah.
And what was the number that you gave?
That are currently almost 1,300.
That was on the study that was done in the late 90s?
Yes, yeah.
And I'm sorry, you said that there was a change that took place in the 2000s?
That's when the data from Cornerstones was converted to GIS data. I believe it was 2010.
I'd be very interested in that,
Yeah,
thank you.
I am too, so we'll look into that. So many of these existing buildings, you know, have the potential to be creatively repurposed for other uses. They don't have to be frozen in time, but we can still respect and acknowledge their original part in our collective history. And the Mayo House is one terrific recent example. But the HRI hasn't been updated since 1984, and a lot of these buildings are not included in the HRI, so that's part of our problem here. It just wasn't, at the time the HRI was comprehensively done, these kinds of buildings just weren't thought to be included. But 1984 was a long time ago, and 35 years later, we know that we need to do this. The HRI can be a really powerful tool to sustain more equitable and diverse communities. So we've fallen a little behind in our work to safeguard some of these historic resources, and we've fallen a little behind other cities' efforts to survey their resources, but we have a really great opportunity to catch up and even excel and show how it can be done better. And entities like the AHC, we're here to partner with you on that. We've already been doing some partnerships and to support that effort. So as you continue to plan the budget, encourage you to please continue to talk about allocating ample and sustained resources for the HRI. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Ingeman, and I'm here to talk with you about incentives. It sounds like I may be preaching to the choir based on some of the positive comments we heard earlier from you all, but I wanted to just underscore the importance, especially since that's my world, financial incentives for historic buildings. I work for Venerable Properties. Some of you knew my mentor, Art DeMuro, who was a tireless advocate for historic preservation and adaptive reuse. And my firm has worked on a number of projects like the White Stag Block and Washington High School and other buildings like that. So I know firsthand the challenges that vintage buildings, URM buildings, et cetera, face when it comes to fixing them up and repurposing them. These days, I consult with a lot of local developers who are also trying to do the good work of historic preservation and face many challenges to reusing buildings. And many of them call me to inquire about the federal historic tax credit and are hoping that this incentive program at the federal level might solve all of their problems when it comes to their pro forma, and trying to find a way to make all of the required and desired upgrades for these old buildings pencil out. Many of them I have to burst their bubble that the federal historic tax credit is not the incentive it used to be. It really does not work well for small to mid-sized projects, and with the recent tax reform bill, it's become even less valuable, and has created a void where we really need additional incentives and more tools in our toolbox, which is one of the reasons.
What is your definition of incentives?
Incentives. I guess I'm thinking of financial incentives, means to encourage people to reuse and repurpose historic buildings, in this case. So we do need more incentives. Just to talk a little bit more about some of the problems that I see, that Oregon in particular is a difficult state in which to do the work of preservation. This is in large part because we don't have a state tax credit, even though we have a state income tax. Many states across the nation use a state tax credit to sort of augment or fill in the gaps where the federal program falls short. We also have a large concentration of buildings in a seismic zone where upgrades are easily triggered, and it sounds like it's possible in the future. There may be mandatory upgrades that are required for URMs. And I would also say, quite frankly, Portland is a jurisdiction that overall has kind of a low flexibility on the building code side when it comes to historic buildings. So historic buildings, we have to find a way to make them comply in this day and age. So along with escalating construction costs, the cards are often stacked against many of these old buildings that really can and should be repurposed. So in thinking about the city's goals towards increased occupant safety during a seismic event and potential mandatory upgrades, this is even a greater call for having financial assistance because building owners are not necessarily going to be able to command higher rents once that money is invested in their buildings in a seismic upgrade. So Restore Oregon has a legislative bill that would enact a state tax credit, and I think this is a very important first step My understanding is the city is behind it, and so I'm here to underscore and ask whatever you can do to continue to provide that legislative backing. That would be wonderful. Of course, thinking of other ways to provide other types of local incentives. And I will end here with just a plug. The Historic Resources Code Improvement Project that's going on also has a set of zoning incentives. And while those are less tangible, they don't put money directly into a project, that there are some incentives that are going to open the door to making it a bit easier for historic buildings to be repurposed in different uses. I have several clients who come to me with, say, a church and a residential neighborhood, or a mansion on Southeast Belmont, buildings that make a lot of sense to be reused in different ways, even though their underlying zoning may not allow for those uses outright. And so that's something else that once that code improvement package comes before you, I hope you'll consider how important those other types of incentives are to historic resources.
Good, thank you. And I just want to say you're correct that the city council supports the historic building tax credit, and we have a full-time lobbying team in Salem during this legislation, and this is one of the issues they've been pushing hard.
Wonderful.
And so thank you for your continued advocacy
Yes,
on that.
thank you.
And I believe there were two more folks, is that correct? Did I get that right, I think? Yeah. Excellent.
I would imagine they did.
They probably did, I just don't want to put them on the record if I don't know. Thanks for being here.
So my name is Skyla Levitt. I'm a graduate, thank you. I'm a graduate student at the University of Oregon pursuing concurrent masters in both architecture and historic preservation. So as a student of our survey and methodology course in the historic preservation program, I participated in the survey of Montevilla this past winter. As a class, we carried out a reconnaissance level survey of properties in the area of Southeast Stark Street and Southeast 82nd Avenue. I found this process of observing these sites and buildings in the field to be a very valuable learning experience because the survey forms required us to be very concise in our descriptions of these sites with respect to material, design, style, form, and character. So at times it was challenging to formulate these descriptions that conform to the survey, but were also comprehensive enough to accurately inform future users of this data without them being present in the field. And we also completed intensive level surveys of properties in that area. Throughout this whole process, we worked in collaboration with a preservation consulting firm, the city, and local community members who were really eager to learn a lot more about the history of their neighborhood, in this case, Montevilla. And as a class, we attended a community meeting where we learned about the scope of the survey alongside residents, and then we were able to listen to their interests, questions, and concerns. One particularly helpful resident, Patricia Sanders, was even able to offer us her own personal research about the neighborhood. And so this project was a chance for us as students to experience carrying out an actual survey and provide meaningful data and research that can be used in the future. So the information that we gathered will help identify buildings and sites that might be eligible for historic designation. And then this database can then help inform a contextual understanding of the built environment that can inform future development and allow for urban design and construction that is sensitive to historic sites. These sites, after all, represent the character, history, and culture of these places. This information will also give us a better understanding of the city of Portland at various scales, and it's an important resource that can be used in the ways that I've mentioned. So in conclusion, this project was a mutually beneficial exercise for both the students of the University of Oregon and the city. And I believe it's really important to continue fostering this relationship between academic and government institutions, as I'm sure there's going to be additional opportunities like this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Falsetto, and I'm an architect here in Portland. I specialize in historic preservation. And in my time here, I want to make a couple points. One is that I was involved as a customer of sorts with the Buck Prager project. So we presented the project to the city for historic design approval, hence being a customer of the city. And we were really pleased to see that it was awarded Project of the Year. And we think it's going to be a great project, but I think the reason it was awarded such is because it was an incredibly complex project that was wholly involved by a lot of people. And going through the process, I would like to say that your staff at BDS did a tremendous job, and your volunteer staff on the Landmarks Commission also did a tremendous job. We thought the process was thorough and rigorous and thoughtful and fair, and we hope to get this going soon as we're done with the LUBA process. The second point I didn't intend on talking about, but Commissioner Hardesty brought up California as an example for funding for seismic upgrades. And a couple months ago, I happened to talk to a California developer, and I was mentioning our challenges we have here in the region, here in the city with our URMs and upgrading them. And he says, why don't you guys do what we do down in California? He was talking specifically, I think, to Santa Barbara. But he said that we have a municipality or a public agency that has bonding capacity. They have the ability to raise a lot of money. What California started doing was using that capacity for sustainability upgrades and then dispensing that money to people that would have certified sustainable projects. And then they enlarged it for seismic upgrades. So they used the same armature and they applied it to seismic work. And the way it works, of course, is that public agency is able to raise a tremendous amount of money, and then they're able to, in that case, grant it out to certified retrofits. And then the owners that get this money, of course, they need a lot of money up front. It's good for that. And then they pay it back through their taxes. So the bond has a tremendous rating because there's nothing better than getting your money back through a tax procedure. And it's great for owners because it meters the amount of money that they have to pay, and they can pay it over a longer period of time. So it seemed like a win-win. And I was wondering if something like that could be considered, should be considered by the city. And you would know better than I, especially since one of you is a former state treasurer, how this process might work for the city to get money up front, apply it to where it needs to be applied sooner than later, and then have it paid back in a metered process.
Yeah, it's an excellent idea, and it does warrant consideration. And as with all things that make a lot of sense, Oregon does things differently. And one of the things that we choose to do differently is the use of general obligation bonds as prescribed in our state constitution, and to create a new class of uses for bonds actually requires constitutional amendments. That's not to say it's an insurmountable obstacle, but it is to say there is something that requires a broader conversation. But I think it's an excellent strategy, personally.
Oh, thank you.
And
Thank you for that
as
insight.
I was doing my Google search around URMs, trying to figure out how do we get out of this box that we're in, and how did other places get out of it so much more quickly, one of the reasons is we continue to have very restrictive policies with regard to the use of financial tools. We don't have the same flexibility that others around the country have with the same tools.
Maybe this can incentivize that change.
Well, it just, putting a positive spin on this, it requires us to build a coalition and create regional partnership, which we should be doing anyway.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you both. Appreciate it very much. So thank you to all of our volunteers on the commission, and thank you to everybody who testified today. Unless anybody has any other thoughts or questions, I'll entertain a motion.
So moved. I move the report.
I second.
Commissioner Fish moves the report. Commissioner Hardesty seconds the report. Any further discussion? Carla, could you please call the roll on the report?
Fish?
Well, this is an excellent report. Yesterday, we got the Design Commission's report. Today, Historic Landmark. It's a wonderful 1-2 punch. I appreciate the way the report's laid out, particularly the photographs and the commentary. The work that you do is really important. I'm pleased that the mayor in his budget is going to fund the historic resource inventory. I share your overall conviction that preserving a building is better than demolishing and replacing it. One of the proudest moments that I've had on the council was to some really tremendous buildings downtown, home to some of our most vulnerable people, that were preserved through that effort. So I share the conviction that you have. I can't wait for the new Allied Works building on 23rd. You keep teasing us about this building. I know they finished the renovation of the other building that was damaged. And perhaps they'll be starting on this one soon. But it's an excellent report. We thank you for your volunteer service, and I'm pleased to accept it today. I vote aye.
Hardesty?
I also want to thank you for a very detailed report, and I really appreciate the conversation that we've had around it. I certainly am appreciative of you volunteering your time to really be thoughtful about how we preserve our history and whose history gets preserved. It is important to me that we are very thoughtful. I'm very disappointed that in the 90s we knew we had an inventory and we did absolutely nothing with that inventory. And so today, here we are, almost 20 years later, maybe more, actually almost 30 years later, and we feel the loss of many of those institutions who no longer exist. So I hope we can do.
Fritz?
Thank you very much to the Commission for all the time that you spent. Thank you to the folks who came and gave time to testify today. Thank you very much to staff. Cara Fioravanti, I forgot to say yesterday, thank you to Tim Heron for the design review work, Hilary Adam and Brandon Spencer-Hartle as well. You could get back to me with the answers to the questions on how much you need for the supplement for land use reviews, and then what are all the bits and pieces of the historic inventory. I appreciate the mayor putting it into his budget. I want to make sure that we know what the entire project looks like. I'm not sure, well, I know we don't have the ongoing money that was requested, and doing the inventory to start off would be a start. But as Commissioner Hardesty pointed out, we do need to then do something about it and make sure that we've got those done. But it's all coming together. I think the unreinforced masonry work is huge, and we do need to decide which of those buildings we want to save and which ones not. So thank you to the Bosco Milligan Foundation. Thank you to Kathy Gilbraith and for your mentioning her legacy of work. Aye.
Wheeler?
Well, I'd like to thank everybody, and I'm sorry I missed the first part of the presentation. Unfortunately, part of my job is learning how to multitask. We are hearing this report at a very important time. We're confronted with existential challenges like climate change, the question of whether or not we're ready for a seismic event, housing affordability, the equity issues that were raised. So there's much more to hear from this commission, and I think even though you're meeting several times a month and you're already dedicating so much of your time, I think we're probably going to be leaning on you even harder in the months and years ahead. I want to personally thank Kristen Miner, Maya Foti, Matthew Roman, Wendy Chung, Annie Mahoney, Ernestina Fuenmayer, and Andrew Smith for your dedication and service to the city of Portland. I'd also like to thank Hilary Adam, who staffs the commission, and of course, Cara Fioravanti, who supervises the BDS staff who do the historic resource reviews. You're a fantastic team. Chair Kristen Miner, thank you for all of the good work that you do in helping to keep us on track. Great report. I vote aye. The report's accepted. Thank you. Colleagues, do you want to take a 2-minute break? Do you need? Okay, why don't we'll take a 4-minute break. Okay, we'll make it an even 5 just because I'm a generous man. We'll be in recess for 5 minutes, and then we'll be right back to hear the CRC appeal.
Item 392, appeal of the Citizen Review Committee against Portland Police Bureau's findings regarding independent police review internal affairs, case number 2018-C-001, appeal number 2018-X-0003.
Council will now take up Agenda Item 392, scheduled for a time certain to consider the appeal from the Citizen Review Committee of the Portland Police Bureau's finding regarding independent police review internal affairs case number 2018-C-0001, appeal number 2018-X-003. This matter is being heard by council pursuant to Portland City Code Section 3.21.160. This is not a public hearing with public testimony. Rather, council is reviewing a decision of the Portland Police Bureau, which the CRC has appealed to council. Council must decide if the PPB, Portland Police Bureau decision, is or is not supported by the evidence in the record. Council will not receive new evidence. I want to note that members of the council have received correspondence from the complainant in this matter. That correspondence is not evidence and is not part of the record, although the complainant will have the opportunity to present to council today on the substance of her complaint. The hearing will be conducted as follows. Number one, IPR will present the case and the procedural history. Number two, the Citizens Review Commission will outline the basis for its appeal and its areas of disagreement with the Police Bureau's decision. Number three, the complainant or a representative of the complainant will have 10 minutes to present. The Police Bureau will have 10 minutes to present. The involved officer or a representative may elect to make a voluntary statement of up to 10 minutes. Council will then have an opportunity to ask questions of any of the presenters. Council is asked to hold all questions until all presentations are finished. Council will then have discussion. Council may elect to move into executive session for its discussion. If council decides to hold its discussion in executive session, an announcement of the executive session and the grounds for going into executive session will be made at that time. Following council's discussion, I will entertain a motion and a second, and we will vote on whether the Police Bureau's finding is supported by the evidence. Under the city code, council must make a decision, and that decision must be supported by 3 affirmative votes of the council. Portland City Code number 3.21.010.s defines, quote, supported by the evidence, unquote, as follows. Quote, a finding regarding a complaint is supported by the evidence when a reasonable person could make the finding in light of the evidence, whether or not the reviewing body agrees with the finding, unquote. Number 9. The Police Bureau's finding was that the complaint was not sustained. If council determines that the Police Bureau's finding of not sustained is supported by the evidence, the complaint will be closed. Number 10, if council determines that the Police Bureau's finding is not supported by the evidence, council will need to decide on the appropriate finding in this case. Council needs to select from the following alternative findings. Unfounded. The allegation was false or devoid of facts, or there was not a credible basis for a possible violation of policy. Exonerated. The act occurred, but it was lawful and within policy. Not sustained. The evidence was insufficient to prove a violation of policy. Sustained. The evidence was sufficient to prove a violation of policy. A finding of exonerated, not sustained, or sustained is based on a preponderance of the evidence. That is, the facts and circumstances indicate it is more likely than not that the violation of policy occurred or did not occur. Debriefings may be recommended for unfounded, exonerated, or not sustained findings when it's believed the subject employee would benefit from a discussion and critique of the incident. 11. No new evidence may be received at the hearing. 12. To protect the identity and privacy of the individuals involved, during the public hearing, council will not refer to them by name, but will refer to them generically as complainant, witness A, Sergeant A, Officer B, etc. Number 13, since the city code provides that no new evidence may be introduced, and because this matter involves council's review of a community member complaint that potentially could result in discipline, public comment or testimony regarding this matter will not be solicited or received. We will now begin the hearing. Here is how the hearing will unfold. Number one, IPR will now present the case and the procedural history. Good afternoon. Name for the record, obviously.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
I'm Rachel Mortimer, Assistant Director of the Independent Police Review. I've been the assigned reviewer on this case since we opened it in January of 2018. I'll provide a brief summary of the complaint and the procedural history of the case. On May 15, 2017, appellant crossed the street in the middle of the block while recording police vehicles as they entered the North Precinct parking structure. Following a brief interaction with a sergeant and an officer, they issued her a citation for jaywalking. Appellant believes she was stopped and cited for exercising her legal right to film the police. The citation was upheld in traffic court after a contested hearing on November 21, 2017. Appellant's attorney provided notice to IPR of this complaint in a letter dated December 29, 2017. IPR opened the case on January 2, 2018. IPR completed an intake investigation identifying 13 allegations and referred it to Internal Affairs for a full investigation, administrative investigation, on January 31st, 2018. Internal Affairs completed their investigation on April 3rd, 2018. The investigation was approved by all levels of reviewers and then set for findings, which were reviewed and approved by May 14th, 2018. On May 30th, 2018, IPR sent a letter to appellant explaining the findings in the case and providing the notice of a right to appeal. On June 18, 2018, IPR received the request to appeal from appellant's attorney. The Citizen Review Committee held the case file review and the appeal hearing on August 1st, 2018 on the 11 appealable allegations. At this hearing, the committee voted to challenge 5 of the allegations and to affirm 6 allegations. On September 5th that same year, Portland Police Chief Danielle Outlaw wrote to IPR regarding the 5 challenged findings. She accepted and agreed with the recommendations of the Citizen Review Committee on 3 of those allegations. On November 7th, 2018, the chief met with the Citizen Review Committee for a conference hearing on the 2 remaining allegations. After discussion, the chief made a new recommendation for a finding on allegation 5, and the committee voted to accept that finding. They were unable to reach an agreement regarding allegation 8. The CRC voted 8-1 to challenge the recommended finding of not sustained and recommended that the finding be changed to sustained. This allegation is now before council. At the conclusion of this hearing, the council must decide whether a reasonable person could conclude that a finding of not sustained is supported by the evidence in regards to the allegation that Officer A issued a citation to appellant in retaliation for exercising legal rights. Thank you.
Does that complete your testimony?
It does.
Very good. Next up, the Citizens Review Commission will now address the basis for its appeal and the areas of disagreement with the Police Bureau's decision. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Malone. I'm the chair of the CRC. The CRC, for those here who don't know, is an 11-member volunteer council-appointed body who is charged with advising the chief of police, IPR, and the council on police policy and hearing appeals of allegations that the police have violated their own policies. I want to acknowledge that several other CRC members have taken time out of their day to be here with us. If you guys want to say hello,
Thank you.
I really appreciate the support. This matter is before City Council for final disposition of an alleged violation of Police Bureau policy. After significant dialogue, the CRC and the Portland Police Bureau are at an impasse with respect to an allegation that Officer A issued a citation to a community member who I'm going to call the appellant. In our process, she's the appellant. I've done it dozens of times. I think technically we are the appellant, but please forgive me. In retaliation for her exercise of legal rights. The CRC found that Officer A's own statements and the other evidence in the case file require the conclusion that Officer A's decision to issue a citation for jaywalking to the appellant was motivated by her lawful and protected activities of filming and photographing the police and appearing to express disapproval of certain law enforcement activities. The facts of this case began on that late afternoon, early evening of May 15th, 2017, around 5 o'clock. The appellant was near the intersection of Northeast 6th Avenue and Emerson, which is very near Central Precinct. This was around the time, North Precinct, which was around the time that the Boys and Girls Club was letting out. There was a lot of activity in the area. At the same time, multiple armored vehicles were returning from what was a CERT engagement to North Precinct. The vehicles are alternately called Bearcats or Bear Trucks. I take it they're pretty impressive and noticeable. The appellant took out her phone and began filming the police as they returned to the precinct. Officer A was one of the CERT members who was returning from the deployment. He said as he was pulling into the facility, he noticed that appellant was filming. He noticed the expression on her face. He noticed that she was expressing disapproval for their activities. After unloading the vehicle, he decided that he would issue a citation for jaywalking. He said that because he was in tactical gear, he wanted to involve another Bureau member who was in uniform at that time. That's how Lieutenant A became involved. As Officer A and Lieutenant A were discussing this plan inside the precinct, the appellant went briefly to the Boys and Girls Club across the street and then returned to a parking garage on Northeast Emerson and 6th, where she began taking some additional photographs of police vehicles. Around that time, Officer A made verbal contact with the appellant from on top of the police parking structure. He too had his phone out and was taking pictures of the appellant. He asked what she was doing. She told him that she was photographing equipment that her taxpayer dollars had paid for, or something similar. As the appellant continued to talk with Officer A, Lieutenant A approached her from behind and initiated the process of issuing her a jaywalking citation. As you've read in the case file, which you had to review in its entirety, that encounter escalated from that point. It resulted in numerous allegations against Lieutenant A and Officer A, including force allegations. All of these allegations have been resolved, but the CRC encourages counsel to carefully review that file in reaching its conclusion. The allegation currently under appeal is Directive 310.20, retaliation prohibited. It defines retaliation as adverse conduct towards an individual not otherwise authorized by law or policy, which is in response to an action taken or perceived to be taken by an individual. Retaliatory conduct may impact personal or professional reputations, may impact an individual's ability to perform their job, and may deter an individual or other individuals from exercising their legal rights, or making or supporting a claim or a complaint. The policy goes on to state that any form of retaliation against a community member is prohibited, and lists as examples Bureau members issuing a citation or taking other action against a community member for exercising their legal rights, or questioning the legality of a Bureau member's actions. In connection with this appeal, as the Bureau has in other appeals, Chief Outlaw and Internal Affairs have confirmed the Police Bureau's interpretation of this rule as prohibiting issuing a citation for conduct that is in fact unlawful if the citation was issued with a retaliatory motive. The example I've used with them, and will use again today, is the idea that if I'm going 31 and a 30, and I'm issued a citation because somebody recognized me as the chair of the CRC, For this allegation, Officer A's motivations are what the questions really boil down to. He discussed these motivations during the course of the investigation. He said, the second that, we're coming up the road and she was taking the photos, like I saw all that, I would have written the citation for jaywalking, I guess, no matter what. It's just one of those, she made it so overt to me. It caught my attention enough, Like I said, I don't care about people recording me, but something about this whole event had spurred me on to at least want to go talk to her. And so I was going to write her a citation for improper placement on the highway. He said she was talking to people and shaking her head and gesturing at us. And, in my head, I was thinking, which I don't know if I should even be talking about this, unless there is, and then there's a sound, which I believe is the officer's union representative cutting him off. And he says, all right. Although Officer A's report mentioned ambush-style attacks on the police nationally and people making threats about the police, he reported that those were simply things that he should be aware of and stated, I'm not saying she was trying to harm the police. That was not my intent. Those other things were things that I had thought about, not reasons for stopping her. The CRC challenged this allegation at an August 1st hearing and met with Chief Outlaw and discussed this at length on November 7th. From the CRC's perspective, Officer A made a clear connection between the protected activity and his decision to issue a citation. He thoroughly described his thought process and his motivations. He didn't issue anybody else jaywalking citations that day. He was not on traffic duty. The other reasons that he suggested were either backtracked or were so general that they should not be sufficient to single out a person for filming the police for a citation. It appeared to the CRC to be indisputable that the only thing that differentiated the appellant from everyone else milling about that afternoon was her filming, speech, and facial expression. The CRC heard Chief Outlaw's position that we can't know what's in someone's head. We disagreed because in this case, Officer A was forthcoming about his thought process, and we thought we did understand where he was coming from. We also understand that the Police Bureau has emphasized that the ticket was found valid in traffic court. But that's not the question here. As the Police Bureau has explained, if a citation is issued, even if there's a lawful basis, the motivation is what matters for violation of this particular Police Bureau policy. We appreciated Chief Outlaw's willingness to engage in dialogue with us, but we respectfully and firmly disagreed, and that's why we're here today. As you've heard from Ms. Mortimer, and as I'm sure you'll hear from the city attorney, the council, like the CRC, is reviewing the decision of Officer B's responsible unit manager with respect to the allegation that Officer A, issued a citation to the appellant in retaliation for exercising her legal rights. Council, like the CRC, must decide if the RU manager's recommended finding of not sustained is supported by the evidence. The question is not whether the appellant was technically violating the law or whether her citation was legally permissible. The question is whether Officer A's decision to issue the citation was motivated by her lawful activity. The CRC found that the evidence pointed decisively and undeniably towards one conclusion, and that to find otherwise would have been unreasonable. Specifically, we found that the allegation should be sustained, meaning that the evidence was sufficient to find a violation of policy. We believe council can and should reach the same conclusion. And lastly, with my remaining few seconds, I urge the City Council to conduct as much of its deliberations in public as possible. Last time this happened, much of what happened occurred in executive session, and we felt like we lost out on a lot of lessons we could have learned. And, lest you thought I wasn't going to mention it, to the extent that council finds that the highly deferential standard of review requires us to adopt the Bureau's finding, we again encourage you to revisit whether that standard is appropriate for a citizen review body. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like us to hold off on questions till the end.
So we'll bring them back.
Yeah, just because I was handed this by legal counsel and I
That's why I didn't ask it after the
Yes,
first one.
they're not going anywhere. They'll be here. Good. The complainant now has 10 minutes to present. Good afternoon.
May I ask a few clarifying questions before I begin?
Legal counsel?
Yes.
You are not considering the letter that you received from me in February and again last week? Was that correct?
The council cannot receive new evidence into the record, but you can talk about the substance of that letter today at the hearing. It's argument, but not new evidence in the record.
Okay. That's not clear, but I assume you all received my letter in February and again in May. And also that your vote today must be unanimous because we are missing 2 members, that's correct?
That's correct.
I find that very disappointing for an issue that has only come before you 3 times in 22 years, that the full council isn't here.
But we're here, so don't scold us.
Regarding the directive on retaliation 301.20, I'd like to be very clear about the phrases that are in there. Officer A took adverse conduct toward me by calling for backup, which resulted in me being detained, threatened with arrest 3 times, and assaulted. And then he wrote me a traffic citation. All of those things are adverse conduct. And he also did so in response to actions that I took, specifically taking pictures. I was not recording, by the way. There was no filming. That's an error in the record. Taking pictures, talking to others, and looking like I didn't like him. All of those actions were legal and legally protected, and they did not interfere with police activity. Worse, when I questioned the legality of his and his colleagues' actions, several times in several different ways over the course of interacting with multiple officers, that really sealed the deal in making sure that they acted in a way that would deter me from exercising my rights in the future. I'm a regular person that stops when police are interacting with members in my community. I do that today. There was definitely a time period after this incident where I did not. And my witness also took him almost a year to agree to come and talk to the CRC, and he is not here today because he is fearful of what happened. I thank Chair Malone for putting a great synopsis of the events before you. I'd like to reiterate the points against Chief Outlaw's arguments in the letter that you received from her and also in the, trying to remember the name of the last hearing we had, the conference hearing, thank you. The first prong is that my traffic violation was upheld in court. But officers weren't standing on the corner measuring the angle at which each parent crossed the street to pick up their children at the Boys and Girls Club. Of course not, because they weren't doing what I was doing, those so-called adverse actions. And they knew better. They spend a lot of time next to North Precinct, and they keep their heads down. So it's the selective enforcement of laws and rules motivated by another intention that matters, not whether or not someone actually committed that offense or whether it was even upheld in court. The second prong of the argument is that Officer A was worried about me planning an ambush-style attack on North Precinct. If we pretend that's actually true, that a middle-aged woman alone with a cell phone surrounded by assault vehicles loaded with weapons is the threat, then he should have contacted me alone to talk. Instead, he made sure that Lieutenant A and Officer B, in fact, ambushed me at the same time with detention for the alleged traffic citation. And that's what makes it retaliation. I'd like to use the remainder of my time to create a bigger picture for this case, because it's taken me 2 years to sit in this seat, and it hasn't been very much fun. I'm a white, middle-aged, middle-class, straight, cisgender female, well-educated, housed, I have no debilitating mental challenges. I'm the very demographic that Portland police seem to protect and serve the most in this city. So I want to take a moment to recognize the privilege that got me here. I'm able to sit at this seat and others are not. Unless officers decide to target me because of the stand I've taken in this case, I can choose to become just another white middle-aged female walking down the street anytime I want and not be subject to police profiling, harassment, retaliation, and abuse for going about my daily life. My fellow community members of color do not have that luxury, especially those that are activists. I fear for the black and brown boys that I work with when they grow to adult size at 13, 14, 15 years old, because that's when they get targets on their backs. Our houseless and transgender community members can't hide from the police any more than a person with a disability, mental health issues, or a non-English speaker can magically make themselves capable of following police orders. I was targeted because of choices that I made that day. They were legally protected choices, but they were my choices all the same. So I hope that behind my voice, you can hear those of all my fellow Portlanders that are retaliated against, targeted, and abused by Portland police simply for being who they are every single day. So I'm really here for them. I also want to emphasize how lucky I am to sit here in this process. As I hope you already know, hundreds of community members file complaints with IPR each year. 85% are rejected out of hand without an investigation. Almost all are then investigated by internal affairs. I made a request that my case be investigated by an independent IPR person. Not only was it still investigated by internal affairs, but we never actually received a reply to that request. I don't call that an independent review in any case, in any sense. Police investigating police. A few cases are appealed for a hearing before the CRC each year, and CRC agrees with internal affairs on most of the allegations. And I believe that's because the process is backwards. We let the police investigate themselves and exonerate their officers first, and then we come back and ask the Citizen Review Committee to say otherwise. So the CRC's held their ground in a conference hearing with the police in only 3 cases in 17 years that this process has been in place. I recognize how rare it is for me to be here. And in the past 2 years that this case has gone on, I've learned that the IPR process fails and is biased toward police in so many ways that I don't have time to list them here today. But suffice to say that I sit in this chair representing literally thousands of community members wronged and abused by Portland police who never got their day in council, as it were. Much less the uncounted thousands more who correctly determined from the statistics that their chances are too low to be worth their time. Or worse, those whose historical interactions with police and in court-like settings have terrorized them too much to even be able to participate in a process like this. So I'm here for them today. I must admit that I'm not terribly optimistic. Since some council members sat here last year deciding Matt Klug's case and refused to give a man tased 6 times in the middle of a mental health crisis any justice. Matt deserved your vote much more than I do. I'll get over what in comparison was mild police treatment, but Matt may be affected by the brutality he suffered for the rest of his life. I'm also not under much illusion that even if you do vote in my favor, that the officers involved will change their ways. The culture of Portland police is capable of changing. Time and time again, cases are upheld to protect the rights of community members to observe and record police activities. And yet, I had no problem finding 3 other people assaulted by Lieutenant A under the same exact circumstances in the previous year and a half to my case. The same officer, people filming or photographing police activity. He assaulted 4 people in a year and a half. So what do cases won matter? What do debriefings matter? What do changes in training and policy matter if cops keep doing the same thing over and over anyway? What does the DOJ settlement matter when they keep murdering our young black men and folks in mental health crisis at the same rate as before? We had another deadly shooting this week. while investigators overseeing the process say that everything's fine. I beat the odds over 2 years to sit in this chair, and in the end, the result, I don't believe, will make much difference. So what I'm really here to ask you to do is to use your power to start truly taking power away from the Portland Police. You did it by voting to get Portland out of the JTTF. You're considering more with Commissioner Hardesty's proposal to institute a non-police response team for 911 calls involving mental health crises. Forgive me, I forget the name.
Portland Street Response.
Thank you, Portland Street Response. In recognition that it's absurd to have people with guns to be the responders in these cases. You can do much more. Follow the example of the brave Portland students this year who flipped their school board's decision to spend their scarce education dollars for more cops in their schools. You can start truly depolicing our city. We can stop letting PPB investigate itself in so many different processes. We can shift significant funds away from neighborhood watches, which we're asking for more money for. They turn community members into snitches. Instead, we can invest in more neighborhood mediation to help people solve their own problems. You can instruct the Bureau of Emergency Operations to tell the 50% of 911 callers reporting people whose behavior they simply don't like, many of whom who are houseless, that police simply will not respond when there's no crime being committed. You can tell the Fire Bureau to immediately remove their riot medics from PPB riot squads, where they are complicit with harming instead of helping the community. And you can take away the weapons of war that PPB uses at protests before they actually kill someone, which they've almost done many times in the past 2 years since I last sat in this chair and warned you that they would. You made a resolution against white supremacy, so why would you possibly allow cops to attack the folks that stand up to resist them?
So I'm sorry to interrupt. You're a minute over, and I will let you continue within reason, but I'm going to add the same amount of time onto the response for the police bureau. Are you close?
That's reasonable, and I
conclude?
appreciate that. Thank you.
There.
I am close.
Okay, very good.
You control the money. So start taking it away from the police and putting it where it really belongs, helping instead of harming the most vulnerable among us. Instead of wasting more taxpayer funds on police accountability processes like this that help very few, let's start taking the police out of every aspect of our daily lives so we can all live with the dignity and peace that we deserve. I'd like to close by noting that the police get the last word in this process and urge you to ask me questions at the end so that I can tell you what really happened, because of all the people in this room, I'm the only one that was there. Thank you.
Thank you. Question for legal counsel. So we have heard a broad statement that goes well beyond the purview of this hearing. What is your advice to us?
It's, the statement was allowed. It's argument. It's not evidence. Your decision should be based on the evidence in the record and argument that you find helpful in making your decision.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Next up, the Portland Police Bureau will have 11 minutes and 47 seconds, should you choose to take that time.
I won't take that long.
Thanks, Chief. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Commissioners. For the record, I'm Danielle Outlaw, I'm the Chief of Police of the Portland Police Bureau. Thank you for allowing us to testify on this matter today. But before we discuss this case, I want to make it clear that I take accusations of officer misconduct very, very seriously. It's important also to highlight the significant time and effort that the members of the CRC have put forth as part of our accountability system. The heart of this case is the allegation of retaliation. This would be a violation of policy if an officer were to issue a citation simply because a community member exercised their legal rights. Retaliation on any level is wrong and erodes the trust the community has with its police. In this case, the appellant was first contacted about her behaviors. While the appellant was exercising her legal rights, the officer noted in his report the reason he contacted her about this behavior was due to a heightened alert by police considering the increase in police ambush-style attacks, and also recent vandalism that had taken place at the North Precinct. That vandalism was to police property and vehicles, including spray painting of vehicles, and it had been a recent issue, as I stated, at this specific precinct. Following this contact, the officer issued the appellant a citation for a violation of Oregon law. The officer stated he used discretion when he wrote the citation and did not issue the citation in retaliation for the appellant exercising her legal rights. The judge in this case heard from both parties and could have dismissed the citation or ruled in favor of the appellant. Instead, although both parties were deemed credible, the judge ruled in favor of the officer and found the appellant guilty of the violation. I can understand why the appellant might feel the citation was retaliatory, given that it occurred after her contact with the police. But the fact is that the citation was upheld in court. And the standard of proof for an administrative investigation is a preponderance of evidence. Therefore, given that both parties were deemed credible, given the evidence that we have, I believe the evidence was insufficient to prove the officer violated policy or procedure. This is the same finding determined by the officer's RU manager, the assistant chief, the internal affairs captain, and the IPR assistant director who reviewed the finding. It should be noted that of the 5 allegations that the CRC challenged, I initially agreed with 3 of them, including changing one finding from not sustained to sustained. And then once at the CRC hearing, we came to an agreement on another finding, thus leaving the finding we're here about today. My opinion on this particular case does not negate the hard work of our CRC. Our accountability system is incomplete without the participation of community members, and I welcome the continued input of the CRC on all matters regarding the Portland Police Bureau. In this instance, however, I do not believe there is enough evidence to prove a solid violation of this policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have anything else? Great, thank you, Chief, appreciate it. Next up is the involved officer or a representative if they would like to make a voluntary statement of up to 10 minutes. I don't know if they're here or not.
No, sir.
No, very good. Now, council, Commissioner Fritz, your moment has arrived. Council may now ask questions of the presenters.
So just generally, and somebody comes up if they know the answer, or how does this work?
You know, we don't do this very often,
No,
so
we don't.
let's just sort of wing it and see if it works. If this sounds like a question for you and you can answer it, and unless we call on you, maybe that would be useful unless Robert's twitching over there in the legal box.
I think that's fine.
All right, good.
So I'm interested in the evidence in the record for what you termed as a contact, and then what the appellant talks about in terms of getting the citation, and whether was the citation giving the citation the mechanism to initiate the conversation?
Were you asking a question
Please? I'm asking both sides. I would have asked it to them while they had been here, or
I think we need a police representative on it.
Yeah,
that's
either
great.
police
That's
or somebody
very
from right
helpful.
here.
Thank you all for coming up.
I'm happy to speak to this. I know that the appellant, due to our process, has not had an opportunity to review the full record, so that puts her at a bit of a disadvantage in answering this question. The officer described wanting to make contact with the appellant after observing her behavior. He wanted to know her name, and he said that a citation would be a way to start that conversation and get her name. He used it as an example of good community policing.
I can elaborate since I was there.
So Officer A contacted me from the top of the parking garage asking me what I was doing. I exchanged a few sentences with him and was headed to my car to leave when Lieutenant A came down the sidewalk from behind me and told me that he was detaining me for jaywalking.
And I did see in the evidence that Officer A asked Lieutenant A, and we heard from the presentation that that was because Officer A was in gear and the lieutenant was in uniform. Do we know when the officer asked the lieutenant? Was that before or after this conversation from rooftop to parking lot?
It would seem there was some coordination between them before the contact.
I can answer that question.
Thank you.
I'm Stacy Rovinelli. I'm the internal affairs investigator in this case. The officer said that he originally saw the appellant. Is that? Sorry. As he was driving and returning the truck. It is at that point that because he was in his SRT gear, which is not the normal uniform, he radioed for assistance, and Lieutenant Besner at that point walked out because he was the closest person.
And I'm looking at City Attorney again now. Presumably, all police policies are part of the record, part of the evidence.
You could take judicial notice of it. This policy at question here, the retaliation policy, is in the record.
Okay, so I have a question then. Is it routine that the way you start a conversation is to issue a citation? Is that what's in the police directives?
Not to issue a citation, no. The contact was due to the violation of the ORS.
But we heard that they wanted to talk to the appellant and that the mechanism to do that was to issue a citation. Is that within police policy?
It's my belief it was the violation that initiated the contact, and then he described how he was going through his head about the ambushes that was going on and the mischief that was going on in the vehicles.
I think it says Officer A indicated that the appellant's action caught his attention enough where he wanted to at least go talk to her.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering why the initial, I'm here to talk to you, starts off with giving a citation rather than let's have a conversation about what you're doing.
It's my understanding that it was having a conversation.
I don't think that's changing.
Okay, is there evidence in the record as to how many citations are issued in a given year for pedestrian traffic violations such as the one? There's no evidence in the record about that. And would there have been an opportunity for a CRC member to have asked that question at the appeal? Or is that because that's not in the record, you wouldn't even be able to ask that either?
We do have an opportunity at the case file review to ask for additional investigation to be done. Our understanding is that there are certain kind of no-go areas in terms of what can be asked. We're not supposed to know, for example, the officer's prior disciplinary history or anything like that. Perhaps we could have asked. I don't know if that's investigation that would have been done.
I can answer that. I can't answer the general number of how many that are issued. He has issued that citation before, and that is in the record.
And as to how many times he has issued that citation before?
I believe that is in the record, yes.
And do you know what the number is?
It is either one or two. It is at least once before this one.
Okay. Commissioner Hardesty, did you have?
Thank you. I don't know if I'm allowed to thank the appellant for staying with this for 2 years or not, but it's out there, so forgive me if I did a bad thing.
Thank you.
My question really has to do with Officer A suggested that the reason that the appellate came to his attention was because of ambush attacks that had been taking place against police facilities. Do we have a history of, excuse my term, middle-aged white women ambushing police stations, either in Portland or nationally?
Not on the ambush end of it, but I believe it was a white female and a white male who were destroyed police vehicles at North Station. So that was another one of the, other than the ambush end of it. So I do not know the stats of the ambush end.
And so was the camera that was being used visible to the officer at the time that the officer Officer A rode up in his mega vehicle? Was the camera that the appellant was using apparent at that time?
We both had our cell phones out at the initial contact, yes.
And so so the appellant, I thought I read in the report that the officer, in a desire to get the name of the appellant, and I don't know if it's Lieutenant A or Officer A, and I don't think it really matters that much, but the officer said in order to get the name of the appellant, the decision had been made to issue a citation. That sounds like retaliation to me based on the evidence that I have reviewed. So why, as an investigator, would you not see that as retaliation?
I don't do the findings in this case. I just did the investigation in this case.
Right, okay, so, but your finding was that not out of policy?
No, ma'am,
everything?
I don't do the findings in the case. I just present the facts of the case. Somebody else does the findings in the case.
Okay.
That has changed now.
Okay, I will ask the CRC that question. Maybe you can answer that for me. I'm just a little confused. So if it is in the record that someone is looking to get somebody's name, and the way they're going to do that is by issuing a citation, is that what you are accustomed to when CRC is reviewing complaints? I mean, is that normal, I guess, is my question?
We haven't seen these facts before. I think that you're describing the feeling that CRC got, which was seeing somebody filming, wanting to know their name, deciding to issue a citation for jaywalking that probably otherwise wouldn't have been issued, was the thing that caused us some alarm. And I think that we were alarmed that his first thought was not simply to have a conversation.
May I?
So, yes, appellant, I'd like to ask you to answer that question.
Yes.
Can you just tell me what your reaction was when when Officer A approached you about and actually for that reason?
So a person walking down the parking garage in military assault uniform, filming me, saying, "What are you doing?" was a little alarming. He has no badge on. Obviously, I assumed since I had seen the other officers in their camo that that's who he was. So we exchanged a few sentences, and like I said, I was ready to leave. The pretext of the jaywalking ticket is what allowed me to be detained, forced me to identify myself, and then allowed them to give me orders which, when I questioned and didn't follow immediately, ended in an assault. They asked me for my vehicle registration for a vehicle that they had not seen me operate as well, and that's the only point that they conceded. I said no, and that one was dropped. Officer B, by then, was in his patrol vehicle behind my car. So it would be real interesting if it's in the records that you have, that I'm not privy to read all of, whether they actually ran my plate as well. It was very clear to me that the jaywalking ticket was a pretext to get all of this other information about me, find out if they had anything else on my record that they could use, and scare the hell out of me so I wouldn't do this again.
So if I may, Mayor, I want to ask CRC, is it normal practice for the CRC to take into account a judge decision when they are deliberating on a case? Like in this particular case, I understand that one of the reasons why it was not upheld was because the judge did not throw out the parking ticket. Is that a normal criteria for decision-making with CRC?
I would say that in most of our cases, that's just simply not a factor. But in this case, I don't think that the CRC found it particularly compelling one way or another because it did not, for purposes of the retaliation directive, the question isn't, was the person in fact speeding or was the person in fact jaywalking? It was the motivation wrong in deciding to issue that, take that action against that person? And I think that was what our decision centered on here.
Thank you. I just want to, for the record, say that I appreciate the fact that the chief upheld sustaining the fact that Officer A did not provide a business card because the statute clearly says that it's not when somebody asks for one, but the directive actually requires them to give one at the end of a police-initiated stop. And I think this is a perfect example of a police-initiated stop that is important for the public to know how to complain if, in fact, there is a problem with that stop. So thank you all. This is a very weird way to have a conversation, but I'm adapting. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you all.
Very good. I have some questions as well, and I'd like to hear from the chief and IPR on these questions. I do have a question of the complainant as well. I guess that's you.
Okay.
At this point, I don't know. You had indicated in your testimony that all of the choices that you made were legally protected, but you were issued a citation and a judge agreed that that citation was issued as a result of a violation of the law. Do you dispute that?
I do, and actually the traffic violation is in appeal with the state of Oregon.
Okay.
So it is still in dispute, and jaywalking is actually not a legal term in Oregon. It's not
Okay,
crossing
and
the street
you-
at a right angle, so.
You had
I-
characterized the police as murderers in your testimony. Is that based on the findings?
On the findings of this case?
Well, in your testimony to this panel, you described the police bureau, police officers as murderers. Is that sustained in the findings?
I'm alarmed by the number of people that are killed by Portland police on a regular basis, yes.
Related to this case?
Lieutenant A also has killed a community member, yes.
And you believe he is a murderer based on the findings
do.
in this case? Okay, thank you. I have a question for the chief, and then I also have a question for IPR, and I'm willing to give CRC a crack at this as well. I heard the words feelings related. I heard opinion related. But again, our responsibility here is to the facts in the record. And what was said during the interview by Officer A, he said he did not object if he was being filmed, and he did not write the citation as a result of legally filming. He specifically denied retaliation on the record, and there is no factual evidence in the record that exists to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the officer engaged in any misconduct with regard to this finding. Am I right or wrong on that? Is
That's
that
for
not
me.
what the record shows?
That is correct.
That's correct.
Sorry, you want to pull
respond
one up?
because-
Oh, really?
Sorry. And the microphones slide around.
I think that was CRC's finding, was that all of the evidence besides the statement, "No, I didn't," pointed in the opposite direction. In a sea of people milling about, Boys and Girls Club, the one person who was targeted for police action is a person who was filming. The officer makes complaints about the fact that she was filming, she was glaring at him, that it was overt to him. He brought up ambush-style attacks and a white man and a white woman in a truck driving around yelling bad things about the police, but then later said, "I didn't think that it was her, and that wasn't my reason for stopping her."
But what he did say, and first of all, I want to go back to the record. We have a complainant who believes that these officers are in fact murderers. And if I was confronting somebody that I thought was a murderer, I might have a very different response. But what was said on the record was that the officer was aware that there were ambush-style attacks on the police. He said that he was aware that there had been recent vandalism of police cars at the North Precinct. So hackles are up. He was aware that there was a BOLO, which means be on the lookout for a man and a woman associated with a U-Haul van that was of a safety concern to police officers in the area. And yet he still said that that was not the reason why the citation was issued. And there's nothing else in the record that I can find that suggests he is saying it was because I was biased or because I didn't like her or whatever. I mean, I'm not seeing that in the record.
May I read you a quote again? I don't want to
Yeah,
belabor
sure.
it, but he says, "She had made it so overt to me. It caught my attention enough, you know. Like I said, I don't care about people recording me, but something about this whole event had spurred me on to at least want to go talk to her, and so I was going to write her a citation." He knew, and he said he knew. He did not believe that she was participating in ambush-style attacks, that she was the person identified in a BOLO. And I believe it's a dangerous precedent
But we
to say
don't know.
that simply because
We don't know based on the
He did not
record.
think, though.
Nobody knows.
Nobody
Well, that's
knows,
correct.
but if anybody with a
And
camera
we're
could be an
dealing with
ambush.
a reasonable person standard here. And in terms of reasonable people, we have 6 different people, including Internal Affairs. We have the Independent Police Review Commission. We have the Chief of the Operations Branch. We have the Lieutenant, the Commander, and the Chief, all looking at this record. And the chief, I think, has actually been extraordinarily forthcoming. She's said, you know, in some of these cases, she was actually willing to be flexible. But on this one, honestly, I'm struggling to figure out how you can make this leap.
I think that, I mean, if we've laid out our reasons, if you disagree,
Fine.
that's fine, but I think that the evidence that we saw in the record all seemed to point decisively in the direction that we found.
If I may, Mayor.
Yeah, please, Commissioner Hardesty.
I am, I greatly appreciate the amount of time volunteers spend in reviewing cases of alleged police misconduct. And I think that we have to, citizens community members who spend a lot of time reviewing cases, it's important that they use a regular person perspective. I feel that it's inappropriate to set the same standard for community members that we set for professionals. And when people are investigating themselves, of course they believe that they do nothing wrong. So I appreciate the fact that that community members who volunteer to read all these reports and really weigh the evidence unanimously came out on one side. I've been in enough of these situations myself personally that I believe that the reason that the citation was given was because it was a retaliatory act meant to diminish a community member's taking pictures, filming, to make that person be fearful of their next encounter with law enforcement. And so I just think it's a bit disrespectful to expect volunteers to have the same understanding of police who have been professionally trained to investigate themselves in cases of misconduct. So that's all I want to say.
I don't have any argument with that, except that this is the process that we currently have before us. And this is ultimately a question of whether or not the officer was in compliance with the policies and practices and standards. This is, in effect, an HR matter. And there are legal standards and requirements of this body in either upholding the findings or overturning those findings. And frankly, I have a lot of confidence in the CRC. I meet with the CRC on a regular basis, and I think they are legitimately doing their very best. But I'm concerned that we are bringing much broader perspectives to the table and perceptions about policing that go well beyond the narrow scope of this hearing. Our job is to either uphold the reasonable standard with the findings on the record or say no. A reasonable person could not, based on the record, have come to the conclusions that they all came to. And so where I'm struggling here is just trying to figure out how can we declare all these persons unreasonable based on the findings that I don't believe sustain the basic argument of the complainant.
May I reply?
Certainly.
I think that relying upon the opinion of the folks that you listed, the vast majority of whom are part of Portland Police Bureau, is a false way to look at it. As Commissioner Hardesty pointed out, it's police investigating themselves, and their standard is different than the community.
Then we should change that policy. And I'm all for independence.
agree.
I'm all for a charter review change. In many regards, I have my own ideas I'd like to put on the table. But today, this is the process
But
that
it
we
really,
must act on.
it really comes down to the directive. And I laid out the phrases that are in the directive. It took adverse conduct against me in response to actions that I took, including questioning the legality of police actions in order to deter me from exercising my legal rights. There's 4 pieces in there that are met. So, yes, let's stick to the facts. They're there.
Commissioner Fritz.
So there are 11 allegations in the record here.
There were 13 when we started.
Right.
2 were thrown out.
Right, okay, that's helpful to know that, because I was wondering about the numbers. But then there's 6 that the CRC agreed with the findings. There are 5 where they felt that there was not evidence in the record. And of those, there were 4 that the chief agreed with that. So, no?
There were 3 that the chief agreed with, and 1 where we reached a compromise in the conference hearing. And in
Okay.
those 3 that the chief agreed with, again, all of the people before us had reached the same finding, and the chief and the CRC together determined that that was not a reasonable finding.
Yeah, so that leads me to wonder what's in the whole of the record. Now, you said we'd read the whole of the record. Maybe it's a rare chance of occurrence of my staff not putting all of the reading material in front of me or my not looking for it, but I just have a summary. Do you have the whole thing?
I have the transcript. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm wondering, which is why
There
I,
should be a chart in your record of all
you
the
know,
allegations.
but I'm looking at the file. Now, I've got that.
I don't have that much stuff.
I'm looking at the file that Chief Outlaw has.
Yeah, I really
So
don't
if
have a
I'm
lot.
going to make a decision based on the evidence in the record, I really need to read that, not the small summary that I've got
This should be what was delivered to your office in January.
in January.
Yes,
Yeah, and it's like this.
it's that same folder.
Okay, well then, I'm sorry, I need to declare that I have not read the entire record. And so, given that there's that, it sounds like we don't have a 3-person, I'm very sorry. I didn't realize that that had been delivered. And I think one of the reasons this hearing was delayed was that I was going to be away, and so perhaps that file, something happened to it. We do have 2 other members who are not here of the council, and this is a really significant.
They're probably pretty blissful about that at the moment. But why don't we do this? And legal counsel, tell me if this is not the way to go, because I want to make sure that the process is fair to everyone. My suspicion is we may have a split vote, taking the vote today, which we could do. And my understanding is if we have a split decision, we would carry this over, we would close the record. So we wouldn't make people come back. You're certainly welcome to come back, but we would close the record and it would go to a continuation and we would wait until one or more of our colleagues was here. Is that a correct interpretation of code?
That's correct.
Because to make any decision, 3 council members have to vote in favor of it.
Okay, that's correct. And then that
It
would
doesn't just
also
die if it's
give
a 2-1 vote here.
anybody who wants to go back and dive into the record, anybody up here, we could do that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does that seem like a reasonable
That seems
Strategy.
reasonable, but as I look at the chief's file and I look at mine, the chief's got a lot more paper than I do. So, I mean, I just want to make sure that I also have the entire record of what transpired, because just like Commissioner Fritz, I don't want to be making my decision based on selected information, but I'd like to make sure I've had the opportunity to review the entire file.
Robert, do you have a thought on that?
I'm sorry?
You have the entire file.
Okay, I'm going to trust you on that.
Okay. Did you have something?
No, they.
Legal counsel.
CRC and IPR compile the file, deliver it to the offices, and so if they've stated on the record that you've got the whole record, then.
Alrighty.
And could
We'll
I,
make sure you get another copy.
it's got to be there somewhere.
And it may be that because you were not scheduled to be there at the initial one. Oh, I see. I would say it may be because you were not scheduled to be there the initial time this was scheduled. There may have been some communication.
Yeah, because we didn't
error.
expect it to go to a second reading or anything, so we were just like, gosh, I wish I could be there.
We'll make sure that you have
Thank you very much.
a brand new.
And if you could
folder.
also please send me your statement at the beginning, because separate from this, I'm very concerned about the timeline as to,
Absolutely.
you know, it's,
And that's actually even in more detail in the binder as well.
great, thank you very much. And again, I
Second by
apologize.
second.
But I don't know that we'd have been able to get to 3 today anyway, so.
So Robert, do we need to pick a date certain, or what is the process?
I believe you could consult with the council clerk to try to find a time, but you can close the hearing today and then reschedule it at the.
Well, we'll continue it, won't we?
Yes.
We'll close the record,
Close the
but we'll
record and then
continue the hearing.
continue it, so you can take
Okay,
the vote later.
Carla, can you
So we-
find us a day when we're all here, hopefully like a Wednesday or a Thursday afternoon?
This is not something we take public testimony on?
No, that is correct.
And how far out did you want to go? Because
You know, I will say this, I feel sorry for the complainant in terms of how long this process has already gone, so I'd rather not have this extended.
I suspect you might need 5 here in order to be able to get to 3.
I show the next available time with everybody attending is the 16th of May, which is a Thursday, at 3 p.m. That's 2 weeks from today. Is that?
Okay, can you all make it who want to be here?
I guess, I don't have my calendar in front of me.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
If for some reason that doesn't work, let us know and we'll try to accommodate.
I would prefer that Commissioner Fritz has enough time to thoroughly review the file.
And I will do so.
Thank you.
I do
Okay,
apologize
thank you
for
for
not
that.
realizing it was there to be reviewed.
Okay, good. So Carla, could you state again the time and the date?
Yes, it'll be 3 p.m. on May 16th. That's a Thursday.
All right, so this is continued then to 3 p.m. on May 16th. And Robert, the record is closed, is that correct? The record is closed, and we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.